The flight attendant's condescending tone sliced through the boarding chaos like a sharp blade. "Sir, do you need help finding your seat?" she asked, her voice heavy with false patience, clearly assuming she was dealing with someone confused or incapable. Around them, impatient passengers glanced up, some with amusement, others with irritation, watching the elderly man move slowly down the aisle. His weathered hands gripped a worn canvas bag, each step deliberate but unhurried. Some nearby passengers shook their heads, frustrated at what they saw as another delay caused by someone clearly struggling with the simple task of air travel. Then, the old man stopped and looked directly at her. His eyes held a weight of experiences and battles far beyond anything she could imagine. Without a word, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in faded blue ribbon. The flight attendant leaned in, curiosity overtaking her skepticism. As she read the inscription, her face drained of color. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she absorbed the words that would haunt her forever: Medal of Honor, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Welcome to Echoes of Honor, where we discover that true heroes often travel in disguise, carrying their greatness quietly among us. Before we continue this powerful story about respect, honor, and the extraordinary people we encounter in the most ordinary moments, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe these stories of courage and humility deserve to be shared with the world, please hit that subscribe button to join our growing community. Your support helps us bring these important moments to light. United Flight 1847 from Seattle to Atlanta was running 45 minutes behind schedule on a gray Tuesday morning in November, which meant that everyone involved in the boarding process was operating with the kind of compressed timeline that turned routine procedures into exercises in barely controlled chaos. The Boeing 777 was completely sold out, carrying 320 passengers who ranged from business travelers with tight connections to families trying to reach Thanksgiving destinations despite the growing delays. The gate area buzzed with the familiar tension of modern air travel, passengers checking their phones anxiously, gate agents fielding complaints about the delay, and flight attendants trying to process the boarding queue as efficiently as possible while managing the expectations of increasingly frustrated travelers. The aircraft itself represented the pinnacle of modern aviation technology, but the human systems required to fill it with passengers remained as chaotic as ever. Rachel Thompson had been working as a senior flight attendant for 7 years, long enough to develop what she considered professional expertise in managing difficult passengers in complex situations, but not long enough to have learned the deeper wisdom that comes from truly understanding service. At 31, she approached her job with the kind of systematic efficiency that prioritized process over people, viewing passengers primarily as logistical challenges to be managed rather than individuals worthy of genuine respect and consideration. Her training had taught her to categorize passengers quickly based on observable characteristics: seat class, apparent age and health, likelihood of requiring special assistance, and potential for causing delays or complications. Elderly passengers, in her experience, often fell into multiple problematic categories. They moved slowly during boarding, frequently needed help with luggage, sometimes had difficulty following safety instructions, and generally required more attention than she preferred to allocate to economy-class travelers. The passenger who had caught her attention as he made his way slowly down the jet bridge was exactly the type Rachel had learned to manage with efficient but minimal engagement. Robert Yamamoto was 81 years old, moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body carried the accumulated wear of 8 decades, and possessed the kind of understated presence that made him effectively invisible to people focused on their own concerns and schedules. Robert's appearance reinforced Rachel's initial assessment of him as a passenger who would likely require extra assistance. His clothes were clean but unremarkable: a simple button-down shirt, comfortable slacks, and walking shoes that prioritized function over fashion. His carry-on bag was a canvas military surplus bag that had clearly seen decades of use, the kind of practical luggage that suggested limited financial resources and unfamiliarity with modern travel expectations. What Rachel couldn't see, what none of the impatient passengers around Robert could see, was that his worn canvas bag contained something that would have humbled every person on that aircraft. Wrapped carefully in a piece of faded blue silk was the Medal of Honor, America's highest decoration for valor in combat, awarded to fewer than 3,500 people in the entire history of the United States. The medal had been presented to then-Private First Class Robert Yamamoto by President Johnson in a White House ceremony in 1969, recognizing actions that had taken place in the jungles of Vietnam 2 years earlier. The citation, which Robert had memorized but never quoted, described how he had single-handedly assaulted 3 enemy machine gun positions to save his pinned-down platoon, continuing to fight despite being wounded twice, and ultimately holding off an entire enemy company until reinforcements could arrive. But the medal told only part of Robert's story. What it couldn't convey was the weight of the decisions he had made that day, the split-second choices between his own survival and the lives of 32 fellow soldiers who depended on his actions. It couldn't describe the physical pain of fighting with shrapnel in his shoulder and a bullet wound in his leg, the mental strain of maintaining tactical awareness while under constant fire, or the emotional burden of carrying wounded men to safety while enemy forces closed in from multiple directions. The other passengers on Flight 1847 had no way of knowing that the man moving slowly down their aisle had once crawled through enemy fire for 8 hours, drawing the attention of an entire enemy battalion away from his trapped platoon. They couldn't see that his deliberate movements weren't the result of age-related frailty, but the careful precision of someone who had learned that hasty decisions could cost lives, that every action had consequences that rippled far beyond the immediate moment. In the 5 decades since that day in Vietnam, Robert had rarely spoken about his military service. He had returned from war to complete his education on the GI Bill, had worked as a postal clerk for 38 years, and had raised 4 children who grew up knowing their father was a hero but never fully understanding the magnitude of his sacrifice until they were adults with children of their own. Robert had attended Medal of Honor ceremonies when duty required it, had participated in veterans events when specifically invited, but he had spent most of his civilian life focused on being a good husband, father, and member of his community. He believed that his real contribution to society wasn't the 8 hours of combat that had earned him the medal, but the 4 decades he had spent quietly serving his neighbors, coaching youth baseball, volunteering at the local VA hospital, and teaching young people about citizenship and responsibility. As Robert made his way down the aisle of the aircraft, Rachel watched his progress with growing impatience that she tried to disguise as professional concern. The boarding process was already behind schedule, and passengers who moved slowly or required assistance only made delays worse. She had learned that early intervention was usually the most efficient approach, identifying potential problems before they became complications and addressing them with the kind of firm guidance that maintained schedule while appearing helpful. Other passengers were also observing Robert's careful progress with varying degrees of tolerance and understanding. A business executive in first class checked his expensive watch repeatedly, his body language making it clear that any delay was a personal affront to his schedule. A young family struggling with 2 small children and multiple bags appeared frustrated that their already challenging travel experience was being complicated by someone who couldn't navigate the aircraft efficiently. A group of college students returning from a conference whispered among themselves about how elderly passengers should be required to check their bags or travel with assistance if they couldn't manage the basic requirements of air travel. Their comments reflected the casual cruelty that often emerges when people feel inconvenienced by others they consider irrelevant to their own concerns. The irony of the situation was profound, though no one recognized it at the time. The passengers growing impatient with Robert's measured pace were benefiting from freedoms that had been secured, in part, by his willingness to risk everything for people he had never met. The business executive worried about his meetings lived in a country where commerce could flourish because men like Robert had fought to preserve the democratic institutions that protected economic freedom. The college students complaining about his pace enjoyed the privilege of education, travel, and free expression because others had been willing to pay the ultimate price for those rights. The young family concerned about their vacation schedule could travel safely with their children because previous generations had fought to ensure that America remained a place where families could pursue happiness without fear of invasion or oppression. Rachel decided that professional intervention was necessary to maintain the boarding schedule and demonstrate her competence to both passengers and crew members who might be observing her performance. Her approach was calculated to appear helpful while actually highlighting the passengers' inadequacy, a technique she had developed for managing what she considered problem situations. "Sir," she said, her voice carrying the kind of exaggerated patience that adults often use with children or elderly people they consider confused. "Do you need help finding your seat?" The question was framed as assistance, but her tone and body language made it clear that she was dealing with someone who was having obvious difficulty with a simple task. Robert stopped and turned to look at her, his weathered face showing no irritation despite the obvious implications of her question. His eyes, though aged, were sharp and alert, carrying the kind of quiet intelligence that comes from having faced situations where thinking clearly meant the difference between life and death for multiple people depending on your judgment. Seat 18F, Robert said simply, his voice calm and dignified despite the condescension he was receiving. I believe it's just ahead, ma'am. Rachel's response revealed more about her assumptions and biases than about her professional training. Yes, that's right. Would you like me to help you get settled in? Sometimes the overhead compartments can be challenging for passengers who have difficulty with. She let the sentence trail off, but the implication was unmistakable. She was treating him as if his age automatically meant incompetence, as if his careful movements were evidence of confusion rather than the deliberate precision of someone who had learned that attention to detail could save lives. Several passengers nearby were now watching the interaction with interest. Some seemed to approve of Rachel's efficient handling of what they perceived as a passenger who needed management. Others appeared uncomfortable with the way she was speaking to someone old enough to be her grandfather, but not uncomfortable enough to intervene or express their disapproval. A veteran in row 14, retired Air Force Master Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, recognized something in Robert's bearing that the other passengers missed, the unmistakable posture of someone who had served in combat. The careful alertness that never entirely disappears even decades after the war ends, the quiet dignity that comes from having faced ultimate test of character and courage. Robert's response was characteristic of the humility and grace he had maintained throughout his life. He didn't argue with Rachel's assessment or take obvious offense at her condescending tone. Instead, he simply reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew something that would instantly change not just Rachel's understanding of who he was, but her entire perspective on judgment, respect, and the assumptions we make about people based on their appearance and age. The object that Robert Yamamoto pulled from his jacket pocket was small enough to fit in the palm of his hand, but it carried the weight of history, sacrifice, and extraordinary courage. The Medal of Honor was immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with American military decorations. The light blue ribbon faded from decades of careful handling, the five-pointed star suspended below it catching the aircraft's interior lighting. And most importantly, the inscription that made Rachel's blood freeze, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Rachel's hands began trembling as she processed what she was seeing. The Medal of Honor wasn't just another military decoration, it was the highest award for valor that the United States could bestow. Reserved for actions that went so far beyond normal expectations of courage that they redefined what was possible for human beings under extreme conditions. Her face drained of color as she leaned closer to read the full inscription, her mind struggling to reconcile the elderly man she had just treated with condescension with the reality of what the medal represented. The passenger she had assumed was confused or incompetent was actually a recipient of the nation's highest honor for heroism, someone whose courage had been tested at the ultimate level and had not been found wanting. Robert's voice remained calm and dignified as he provided context for her obvious shock, speaking not out of pride, but simply to help her understand the magnitude of her mistake. Private First Class Robert Yamamoto, 25th Infantry Division, Vietnam, 1967, he said quietly. The citation describes actions taken during Operation Junction City, when my platoon was pinned down by enemy machine gun fire. Rachel's shock deepened as she began to understand that she wasn't just looking at a medal, but at a piece of living history carried by someone who had demonstrated the kind of heroism that most people could barely imagine. Around them, passengers who had been watching the interaction with mild curiosity now found themselves witnessing something extraordinary as word began to spread about what was happening. Robert continued, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing events that were simply part of his personal history rather than legends of heroism. 3 enemy machine gun positions had my platoon pinned down in an open field. 32 men were going to die if someone didn't do something. I flanked the positions, eliminated the crews, and held the ground until reinforcements arrived. The understated description masked the reality of what Robert had actually done. Military records showed that he had crawled through 200 yards of enemy fire, assaulted 3 fortified positions single-handedly, continued fighting despite being wounded twice, and then held off an entire enemy company for 4 hours until relief forces could reach his isolated position. Maria Rodriguez, the retired Air Force Master Sergeant in row 14, immediately stood up when she saw the medal. Her own military training kicked in with automatic respect for the highest decoration her country could bestow. Her movement caught the attention of other passengers, who began to understand that something profound was unfolding in the aisle of their aircraft. The business executive who had been checking his watch impatiently now stared in stunned silence, suddenly aware that his professional concerns were insignificant compared to the heroism he was witnessing. The college students who had been complaining about Robert's pace fell silent, confronted with the reality that they had been mocking someone whose courage far exceeded anything they had ever demonstrated or even imagined. Rachel's training had never prepared her for this moment. She had procedures for dealing with difficult passengers, medical emergencies, and security threats, but nothing in her experience had equipped her to handle the realization that she had just condescended to one of America's greatest heroes. "Sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the aircraft's ambient noise, "I had no idea. I'm so very sorry. Please, let me escort you to first class immediately." Robert's response revealed the character that had earned him the Medal of Honor in the first place, the same humility, grace, and concern for others that had driven him to risk his life for 32 fellow soldiers he barely knew. "Miss, I appreciate your kindness, but I paid for seat 18F, and that's where I'll sit. I don't need special treatment. I just need to be treated with the same respect you'd show any other passenger." The gentleness in his correction was perhaps more powerful than anger would have been. He wasn't seeking privilege or recognition. He was simply asking for basic human dignity, the same courtesy that should be extended to every person regardless of their age, appearance, or background. Rachel realized that she had learned something far more important than customer service techniques. She had been confronted with her own assumptions, her own prejudices, and her own failure to recognize that every person carries invisible stories of significance, sacrifice, and contribution that may dwarf anything she had ever accomplished in her own life. As Robert made his way towards seat 18F, Rachel followed at a respectful distance, her entire understanding of service, respect, and human dignity fundamentally transformed by what she had just witnessed. Other passengers who had observed the interaction began to understand that they had just seen something extraordinary, not just the revelation of Robert's heroism, but his humility in the face of condescension and disrespect. Captain Jennifer Walsh, who had been informed by crew members about what had happened, made an unprecedented announcement over the aircraft's public address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Walsh. I've just learned that we have the extraordinary honor of having Medal of Honor recipient Robert Yamamoto aboard our flight today." The cabin fell into absolute silence as passengers absorbed this information. Many had never met a Medal of Honor recipient, had never been in the presence of someone whose courage had been tested at the ultimate level and who had responded with the kind of heroism that redefined what was possible for human beings under extreme conditions. Captain Walsh continued, her voice carrying the profound respect that Robert's service and sacrifice deserved. "Mr. Yamamoto was awarded the Medal of Honor for actions in Vietnam in 1967, when he single-handedly assaulted 3 enemy machine gun positions to save his pinned-down platoon. Despite being wounded twice, he continued fighting and held off an entire enemy company until reinforcements could arrive." One by one, passengers throughout the aircraft began to stand. It started with Maria Rodriguez, the retired Air Force Master Sergeant, whose military background helped her understand the magnitude of what they were hearing. Then an elderly man in row 8 who had served in Korea. Then a middle-aged woman whose father had been a Vietnam veteran. Within minutes, every passenger on the aircraft was standing in silent tribute to the man in seat 18F. Robert sat quietly through the ovation, neither uncomfortable with the attention nor actively seeking it. This response was characteristic of Medal of Honor recipients. They had performed extraordinary acts of heroism not for recognition, but because the situation demanded nothing less, because other people's lives depended on their actions, because courage was the only option available when everything went wrong. Rachel found herself thinking about every elderly passenger she had ever served, wondering how many stories of heroism, service, and sacrifice she had overlooked because she made snap judgments based on age, appearance, or perceived status rather than taking the time to see the person behind the surface characteristics. During the flight, Rachel learned more about Robert's story from passengers who took the opportunity to speak with him. After Vietnam, he had used his GI Bill benefits to complete college and had spent nearly 4 decades working for the Postal Service. His colleagues had known he was a veteran, but few had known about the Medal of Honor until local news coverage of a veteran's ceremony had revealed his identity to his surprised coworkers. Robert had never sought attention for his military service beyond what duty required. He had attended Medal of Honor ceremonies when invited, had participated in veterans events when asked, but had spent most of his civilian life focused on being a good husband, father, and community member. He had coached youth baseball for 20 years, had volunteered at the local VA hospital, and had quietly helped other veterans navigate the challenges of returning to civilian life. After the flight landed in Atlanta, Robert was among the first passengers to deplane, but not because of any special privilege he had requested. Captain Walsh had asked him to exit first so that every other passenger could express their thanks as they left the aircraft. For 45 minutes, 320 people filed past Robert Yamamoto, shaking his hand, thanking him for his service, and telling him that learning his story had changed their understanding of heroism and sacrifice. Rachel made a point of being the last crew member to speak with Robert before he left the aircraft. "Mr. Yamamoto, I want to apologize again for how I treated you. Your service, your sacrifice, your example, they've taught me something important about respect and assumptions. I promise you that I'll never treat another passenger the way I treated you today." Robert's response was characteristic of the grace he had shown throughout his life. "Miss Thompson, we all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them and try to do better. You seem like a good person who cares about doing the right thing. That's what counts." The Medal of Honor that Robert Yamamoto carried represented more than his individual heroism. It represented the courage that exists in countless people who never receive recognition, who never get medals, who simply do what's right because the situation demands it. It represented the hidden strength that resides in ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances and choose service over self-interest. Rachel had learned that respect isn't something that should be earned through demonstrations of achievement or status. It's something that should be given freely to every person as a recognition of their inherent worth and dignity. The elderly man she had condescended to had taught her, through his quiet grace and humility, that true strength often wears the disguise of gentleness. In the months that followed, Rachel began treating every passenger differently. Not just elderly passengers, but everyone. She started seeing each person as someone with a unique story, with contributions they had made, with challenges they had faced, with dreams they were pursuing. She realized that true service meant honoring the humanity in every person she encountered. The Medal of Honor citation that described Robert's actions in Vietnam used words like conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action, but those formal phrases couldn't capture the reality of what he had done. For 8 hours, he had been the only thing standing between 32 American soldiers and death. He had made decisions under fire that saved lives, had endured wounds that would have stopped most people, and had demonstrated the kind of moral courage that most people never have to test. Years later, when Rachel became a trainer for new flight attendants, she would tell Robert's story as a reminder that every passenger deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. She would explain that the elderly man moving slowly down the aisle might be a Medal of Honor recipient, that the quiet woman in the middle seat might be a retired nurse who saved countless lives, that the teenager with headphones might be the child of immigrants who sacrificed everything for their family's future. The lesson wasn't that people should be treated well because they might be heroes. It was that everyone should be treated well because they are human beings with stories, struggles, and contributions that we may never see or understand. Robert Yamamoto had taught Rachel that true service means approaching every interaction with humility, knowing that we never know the full measure of the person standing in front of us. Sometimes the greatest teachers appear in the most unexpected moments, wearing the most ordinary disguises. Rachel Thompson thought she was managing a slow elderly passenger, but she was actually being educated by one of America's finest examples of courage, sacrifice, and grace under pressure. Her assumptions had been challenged, her perspective had been changed, and her understanding of human dignity had been permanently expanded by a man who asked for nothing more than basic respect and courtesy. The worn canvas bag that had marked Robert as someone of limited means actually contained the highest honor his country could bestow. The careful movements that had suggested frailty actually reflected the precision of someone who had learned that every action has consequences, that lives depend on attention to detail. That true strength sometimes requires moving slowly enough to make sure you get it right. This story was brought to you by Echoes of Honor. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Someone whose quiet dignity taught you about courage, service, or humility? Tell us in the comments about the heroes hiding in plain sight in your own life and how they changed your understanding of what greatness really looks like. And if you think stories like these need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.